Well, hello, lovers of freedom. This is Jacob Hornberger, and this is the Jacob Hornberger Show here on the internet. For those of you that don't know me, I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I'm here generally every Saturday night from 7 to 8 to talk to you about the principles of freedom. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about one of the most important aspects of freedom, and that's the right to keep and bear arms. Right that's guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Now, we often hear, of course, that the prerequisites for a free society are the ballot box, where people can go and vote out people and put people into office. The soap box, where you can go out and give speeches and persuade people to your point of view. There's the jury box, where juries can acquit people of laws that are repugnant to a free society. There's also the cartridge box, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, the importance of the right to keep and bear arms with respect to a free society. Now, I don't need to tell most of you listening to this that liberals are absolutely horrendous on this issue. I mean, if it were up to your standard liberal, they would, live in a gun-free society. Just confiscate everybody's weapons, leave all the guns in the hands of the government. And for them, that would be nirvana. I mean, that would be, the dream come true paradise. Because you see, they see government as their provider, as their big brother, as their daddy, as their God. I mean, that it gives them their welfare and their Social Security and their Medicare and their Medicaid and their subsidies, and it takes care of them. And so the thought that that government might be a threat to their freedom doesn't even enter the mind of a standard liberal. But of course, conservatives are not much better on this issue. They're a little bit better, but what you hear all too often from conservatives is that, well, the right to keep and bear arms has to do with deer hunting. I got a right to go out and hunt deer. And by golly, I have a right to keep and bear arms so that I can go out and shoot deer and feed my family with the deer meat. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, the right to keep and bear arms doesn't have anything to do with the right to go out and kill deer. And so we're going to be talking about tonight. I mean, really, the only ones that are really good on this issue, not surprisingly, are the libertarians. I mean, this is one area, along with lots of others, of course, where we're absolutely solid. That the right to keep and bear arms is a guarantee of a free society. It's an insurance policy for a free society. Now, those of you that have been watching the show for a while know that I always think it's important to go back to first principles. That's what distinguishes libertarians from liberals and conservatives, is that we have an underlying philosophy of liberty. We believe in certain moral principles, and so there's a consistency. I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about libertarianism is this consistency of principles with respect to our philosophy, as compared to the statists, liberals and conservatives, that sort of, they believe in sort of an ad hoc approach to things. A conservative might say, well, I really don't believe in food stamps for the poor. But I do believe in, farm subsidies, or I believe in Medicare and Medicaid, but not, welfare for the poor, aid to families with dependent children. There's just this ad hoc approach to freedom that characterizes liberals and conservatives and other statists. But with libertarians, there's an underlying consistency because we have an underlying philosophy that's guided by underlying moral principles. Now, with respect to these principles, I think it's important to go back to first principles here of the United States. Our heritage of liberty, and those of you that have been listening to this show know that I often go back to the Declaration of Independence. I mean, I think that's critical because I think Jefferson said it all right there in that critical paragraph where he says that man has been endowed with certain fundamental rights. Okay, now do these rights come from government? No, that's not what Jefferson's saying. He's saying that they are inherent to us as individuals, as human beings, that they're natural rights. They come into existence as part of our nature. They're God-given rights. They're endowed in us by the Creator. And so nobody's got to be beholden to any government official for these fundamental inherent rights. So where does government come in? Well, Jefferson points out what the purpose of government is. It's to secure these rights. In other words, to protect people's exercise of these rights, but not to become the destroyer of these rights, not become the infringer of these rights. In fact, Jefferson points out that when government becomes the destroyer or the infringer of these rights, people will put up with a lot. But ultimately, people will finally say enough's enough, and that they have a right to alter or abolish that form of government. Now, fortunately, we live in a country where all this can be done peacefully. We've got the ability to elect people into office that share our philosophy. We have the ability to persuade people with our ideas. We have the ability to seek constitutional amendments that remove abusive powers from the hands of government officials. Now, so keep that in mind, that man has been endowed with certain individual rights. And this doesn't just apply to Americans. I mean, Jefferson is saying that all human beings, just by their nature, by the fact that everyone is created by God, everyone is endowed with these fundamental inherent rights. Not just Americans, but everyone living in every country around the world. So, when the Constitution was enacted, the idea was in the Constitution was to call into existence essentially a new federal government. I mean, the American people had been living under the Articles of Confederation for a little bit more than 10 years from the time of the Declaration. And so the people that were advocating a federal government, came to the American people and said, "Look, we're having problems with the Articles of Confederation. We want to use this Constitution to call into existence the federal government." Well, Americans were very, very skeptical about this. I mean, why? Because they considered, and this is something that Americans today have never learned or have forgotten. That the reason Americans were skeptical, leery of this new federal government, the federal government that exists in Washington, was because they feared that this government would become like the governments throughout history, exercising tyrannical powers, dictatorial powers, infringing on their rights. They just didn't want to have anything to do with such a thing. Well, the advocates of this government said, look, you don't need to worry about that, because here, for the first time in history, the document that is calling this government into existence is strictly limiting its powers. And so if a power isn't enumerated in this document, they can't exercise it. So you don't need to worry about government, shooting protesters here in the United States, or rounding people up, or any of this sort of thing, denying people freedom of speech or freedom of religion and so forth, because it's not among the enumerated powers. And the enumerated powers are so small that really there's no possibility that this government could ever become abusive or tyrannical or infringing on the fundamental rights of the people. Well, the American people reluctantly decided to go along with the deal, but only on the condition that a Bill of Rights be enacted after the government was called into existence. And so that was the deal that was struck. Okay, we'll approve the Constitution. That calls into existence the federal government. Again, it's we the people who are called into existence. It is the servant. We are the master. We the people are the masters in the private sector, and the government would remain the servant. But just to make sure nobody gets any wrong ideas as to the real limitations on this government, we're going to have a Bill of Rights. So the way to look at this is the Constitution is like a straitjacket. Okay, it's just tying in the government. It's like a series of entanglements and so forth that prohibits the government from doing too much, especially the abusive too much. Well, people often think, well, but the Bill of Rights gives us our rights and the Constitution gives us our rights. Well, not so. In fact, if you take a careful look at the Bill of Rights, you'll see something really important here. And that is that the Bill of Rights really should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions. Why? Because if you carefully look at the language of every amendment, you'll see something really important there. that the language prohibits the government from interfering with pre-existing rights, important rights. So it's not giving people's rights, because our American ancestors understood what Jefferson said. Our rights don't come from the government. So, the Bill of Rights is not going to be giving us rights. The Bill of Rights is going to be expressly stating that the government cannot interfere with certain fundamental rights. Now, why did they see fit to do this? Why did the American people insist on this? Because they understood the likelihood that their own government, the federal government that was being called into existence by the Constitution, would do these things. That they would take away people's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, that they'd go after protesters, that they'd confiscate guns, that they would incarcerate people without due process of law, without jury trials, that they would go out and arbitrarily search people. Why did they think this? Because this is what their governments in history had done. Their British governments. And remember, they came out of this from the British Crown primarily. And so they knew that the British dictators, the British kings, had done these kind of things. And so they said, look, we don't want to take any chances. We like this idea of the straitjacket in the Constitution, but just to make it clear, we want to make it sure that these government officials, whoever they are, living in 1787, 1800, 1900, 2000, 2010, 2011, whoever they may be down the line, they cannot do these things. And the reason is, they said, because if we don't put them in, these people, the people that government attracts, the power lusters and so forth, might get the idea that, hey, they can do this, and we want to make it real clear that they cannot. And one of these, of course, was the idea of gun rights. Now, they made the Second Amendment second, but, I often think that sometimes they should have put it first. Because without the second, the first one really becomes rather meaningless, because the second one guarantees the first one. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But what's important here, first of all, is to realize that our rights don't come from the government. The right to keep and bear arms doesn't come from the Second Amendment. In other words, if the Second Amendment had never been enacted, if the Bill of Rights had never been enacted, people would still have the unfettered right to keep and bear arms, simply because of their nature, because this is a God-given right. Now, how do I arrive at that? Well, because we talk about ownership and property, that we have ownership rights over our body. I mean, government didn't create us. We know that. And so, what we do with our own body belongs to us. That's what ownership is, self-ownership. Now, is it violated? Of course. The drug war is probably the most, notable example of this violation of self-ownership. But, keep in mind that we haven't had a drug war throughout American history. For more than 130, 40, 50 years, Americans said, we got a right to do what we want. We want to ingest a harmful substance. That's our right. That you, government, in this straitjacket, you don't have the legitimate power to tell us what we can put into our bodies and what we can't. In fact, that's why it took a constitutional amendment to criminalize the ingesting of alcohol. Because without that constitutional amendment, everyone understood that government didn't have that authority. Now, of course, in the age of statism in the 20th century, the age of the welfare state, the age of the U.S. empire, the age of interventionism, all that's been discarded, where government claims the legitimate authority to regulate what you put into your body, whether it's bad foods or booze or cigarettes or drugs or whatever. But in terms of fundamental rights, there's no question that this is an illegitimate exercise of power. Why? Because every individual has the right of self-ownership. And by the same token, you have a right to accumulate things. Because you're out there in the marketplace, you're accumulating wealth, you're trading with people, you're working for a company, or you've got your own company, you're accumulating wealth, you go out and buy things. Those things are yours. Your automobile, your home, your clothes, your things, these belong to you. And you have a right to accumulate these things. and of course, as part of accumulation of property, of the right to own things, the right of ownership, the right to private property, is the right to own guns. I mean, that's just inherent as you're being a human being. This is one of these God-given rights. This is one of the rights that Jefferson's talking about. It's not just the right to speak out. It's not just the right to, protest. It's not just the right to read what you want to read. It's not just the right to criticize the government. It's the right to own things, to own a house, to own, as long as you go out and buy it. You can't go out and steal it and say, well, I got a right to own it, because you go out and steal it from someone else. That's violating their rights. Same thing with guns. You have a right to own guns simply because you have a right to own things. So the right to keep and bear arms exists independently of the Second Amendment. All the Second Amendment was doing was the same thing the First Amendment was doing. It was expressly stating to government officials, it was sending a message to federal officials, you don't have the power to take these rights away from us, the pre-existing rights, the inherent rights, the rights that inhere in us by virtue of our humanity. Now, one of the factors involved in the right to keep and bear arms is the right of self-defense. You got a right to defend yourself. Now, first of all, we're talking about violent people. Now, most people in society, as we all know, are peaceful, law-abiding people. You go to work every day and you encounter, any numbers of people, and nobody's, there's not this chaos where people are shooting each other, indiscriminately, and, robbing each other and stealing from each other. I mean, by and large, you can go through your daily affairs and where everybody's peaceful, interacting with each other. Okay, there's arguments and so forth, but there's not violence being exercised. But we all know that there's a small minority of people, I don't know what the number is. Let's just say hypothetically it's 5% that is out there, stealing from people, robbing from people, murdering people, raping people. And those 5%, are gonna use violence to get their way. And you have a right to defend yourself from that. And that's one of the ideas of gun ownership. This is the reason why people, acquire guns. One of the reasons is not just to go out and shoot deer, but to protect themselves from this small minority of people, the 5% or the 3%, whatever the number is, who would initiate force against them. The murderers, the rapists, and so forth. Now, we all know that sometimes these people are bigger than the average person, the murderer or the rapist or the thief or whatever, especially when you're dealing with women. Well, the gun's a great equalizer. It doesn't matter how big a guy is. You hit him with a 9mm and he's going to go down. So the gun provides a means of defense against the violent people in society. Now, this is one of the funny things about liberals. I mean, they have the most incredible blind spot when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms. It's the most amazing thing. They take the position that if you pass a gun control law making it illegal to acquire guns, that murderers will obey that. I mean, it's inane, and you can't get through to them. I mean, you sit there and you try to reason with them, and you say, look, if a person's not going to obey a murder law, it's very unlikely he's going to obey a gun control law. And the liberal says, oh, absolutely not. You make it illegal on a murderer, he will obey that gun control law, and it's inane. You can't get to them. You can't reason with them. But, logic just tells you that if a guy's going to go out and commit a criminal offense that's going to subject himself to the death penalty or to life in prison, he's not going to sit there and say, well, I better not use a gun. I better use a knife because I could get 10 years in jail for illegal gun possession. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, a guy that's going to initiate force, is going to initiate violence, is going to be not concerned about a gun control law. He's going to acquire the gun because that's his best means of subjecting his victim to what he wants to do to him. If he's going to kill him, I mean, there's few better ways than a gun. I mean, sure, there's knives and so poison or whatever, but gun's the weapon of choice for the murderer, usually. The rapist can subdue his victim with a gun much more easily than with a knife, because the victim knows it. I mean, he shoots the gun, man, it's all over. And so the right to keep and bear arms ensures that a person's at least got a shot at defending himself against the violent people in society. Well, what does a gun control law do, though? Well, it inevitably disarms the innocent person. Because guess who's going to obey the gun control law? Yeah, the average citizen, the person that does not want to subject himself to a felony conviction, to see himself carted off to a federal penitentiary for 10 years, 20 years, or whatever. So it's the peaceful citizen that says, I can't afford to take this chance. I got to go along with this law. I got to get rid of these guns. I got to turn them into the government. And because the government's saying that now it's illegal to own them. I mean, it was sort of like when the government made it illegal for Americans to own gold. A lot of Americans sent their gold into the government because it was a felony offense if you got caught with gold. Now, a lot of people kept it anyway, but they were taking a risk because if they got caught by the feds, inadvertently, the gun goes off or illegal search or whatever, the feds would go after them. They would prosecute them. And so, this is the whole idea of gun control. It disarms the innocent. Now, don't get the idea that if somebody's illegally caught with a gun, they won't really do anything. Oh, are you kidding? I mean, if you really believe that, man, you're living in la la land. In fact, we just linked to an article in Friday's FFF email update, which is our daily commentary page that we send out to everyone every day. If you're not subscribing, we'd like to invite you to subscribe. But one of those articles that we linked to tells the story of a young man. He was about 25 years old. Perfect citizen, didn't have record spotless, and he was just like an average guy, like people like you and me, and law-abiding citizen. He wasn't your robber or thief, didn't have any criminal record and so forth. Well, he was moving from Colorado to New Jersey, and he was over at his parents' house who were living in New Jersey. He was having a hard time in his marriage. I think his wife and he were splitting up or something. And one day he lost his temper and he just really flew off the handle, and he left his family's home to go to his new place because he was moving things over there. And his parents were so concerned, they called 911, but they hung up before anything happened. But the cops had caller ID, and so they came to the house. They summoned the guy back. They searched his car. They found 3 pistols that had been, locked safely in little, safety cases. They were in his car that he was moving from his parents' house to his house. Well, they charged him with a felony offense. And you might think to yourself, well, they didn't do anything to him. Oh, are you kidding? They put him away, I think it was for 7 years. I mean, some jerk judge sent this guy away for 7 years. Felony possession of guns. I mean, they were in a locked case. They were legal in Colorado. I think they would have been legal if they had been in his house, although I'm not sure because New Jersey has about the strictest gun control laws in the country. But the fact that he got caught taking them from his parents' house to his house, felony conviction. Now, because there was a big outcry among people on the internet and so forth, the Governor Christie, commuted his sentence to time served. I think he served a couple of months, 3 or 4 months or something, in hard penitentiaries, with gangs and so forth. And he didn't pardon him. It's still on his record. He cannot own guns. It's just a travesty. But this is what they do. This is what the statists do. So, if you think that a gun control law, that you can get around it, that you can, somehow or another finagle your way. I mean, suppose they pass this gun control law at a federal level and they make it a felony offense to own guns, and all of a sudden a burglar comes in and is threatening your family and you shoot him. You're going to go away for 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever the case may be. So, that's what the gun control law does. It disarms the peaceful, law-abiding citizen. Now, there's another factor here. Liberals think, oh, well, wait a minute, Jacob. Now, if we can just get rid of all the guns in society, it'll be a gun-free zone, It'll just be one giant continental gun-free zone, and so they have this paradise in their minds that's sort of like Cuba, where all the guns just magically disappear. Well, the guns don't just magically disappear. I mean, there's millions of guns. It's already done. It's out there in the marketplace. They're owned. So what would a war on guns do? The illegality of guns. Well, what has the war on drugs done? I mean, do you not see massive violence, corruption? Look at Mexico. Was it how many people have been killed in the last 3 or 4 years? 30,000 or something because of the war on drugs. They haven't really. They've had decades to polish their act, get their act together, get rid of drugs out of society, and of course they've totally failed. Now that hasn't stopped them from continuing to try. I mean, they're still waging the war on drugs with a viciousness, the likes of which is just very difficult to imagine. There was a young lady. That I forget which state, but recently she was about 25 years old. She got caught selling $31 worth of marijuana to a police informant. She had no criminal record, and she has 4 children, minor children. She's 25 years old. She's not white, and the judge sentenced her to 10 years in the penitentiary. Is that going to do anything to stem the drug tide and so forth that's been going on for decades? Of course not. I mean, the judge has just ruined another life. $31 worth of marijuana. Can you imagine that? And but now translate that war on drugs with all the violence to a war on guns. I mean, can you imagine a black market in guns? I mean, right now, the liberals complain about the gun shows, and the gun dealers and so forth. Now, suppose you made all that illegal. Well, all of a sudden, now you're talking about gun lords, drug lords. Drug lords translate into gun lords. And you've got all the turf battles and the gun battles and so forth. And you've got, you think you've seen violence in the war on drugs. You ain't seen nothing till they start making the guns in the same category as the drugs. Now, notice how they integrate these two, violations of liberty. That they use all the violence and the consequences, the adverse consequences of the war on drugs. The gang wars, the drug cartels, the killings, the massive death and destruction. They use that as the excuse to have gun control. I mean, that's what's going on now, where on the border, the U.S. officials are calling for tighter controls on the gun dealers along the border because they're selling guns to drug dealers in Mexico who are using them to kill, government officials, private officials, and so forth. You see, it never occurs to them that what they really need to do to get rid of the drug lords overnight, immediately, is just legalize drugs. I mean, ended this thing the way Americans finally came to their senses and ended prohibition. But there's a lot of people making money off that war on drugs. The government officials are making money. There's bribes. There's kickbacks. There's campaign contributions because it's a favorite little campaign device. Oh, I'm against drugs, therefore I favor the war on drugs. I mean, it's a big money maker. Judges are on the take. DEA agents on the take. Cops are on the take. And so the last thing they want to do is end the war on drugs, but they use that as the excuse to then start taking away more of people's freedom, and that's with respect to the confiscation of guns, gun control, and so forth. Now, okay, so you've got self-defense as one of the rationales here, but it goes much deeper than this, and this is what distinguishes libertarians from conservatives. Conservatives will talk about self-defense in the home and so forth, but what our ancestors understood is the real idea of the right to keep and bear arms is to serve as an insurance policy against tyranny. And this is what conservatives will never say. I mean, they're so worried about, will the mainstream media will they respect me in the mainstream media, and will they vote for me, and will I lose power? And so they end up doing this deer hunting thing, or maybe, protect against burglars. Well, it's the libertarians that explain to people that it's the right to keep and bear arms, the cartridge box, that is your ultimate guarantee, your ultimate insurance policy against tyranny. Now, we're getting a lot of information about tyranny these days, aren't we? I mean, we're seeing that firsthand in the Middle East. It's absolutely fascinating. And Americans who don't learn lessons from this are missing a big opportunity, because there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. I've had the good fortune of traveling to Europe several times, and I interact with people over there, and one of the things that inevitably we get into is gun control. And Europeans have always said, "Oh, you've got so much violence in America with all your guns," and of course they don't realize that it's the war on drugs that's engendering most of the violence. And they say, "Oh, well, here in Europe we don't have this problem because we have strict gun control and gun confiscation and so forth." Well, what I've told them is, I said, "Well, yeah, but we have something in America that you don't have. We have the ability to defend ourselves in the event that the government's ever taken over by a bunch of tyrants." In other words, if they impose a totalitarian tyranny in the U.S., Americans have the ability to defend themselves against this. And in fact, because you've got widespread ownership of guns. But in Europe, as I tell them, if you get a totalitarian dictatorship, you have no effective choice. You either submit or you die. You don't have the last option. That is the option that Americans have, and that is to defend yourself against goons in the government that are out murdering people in the private sector. Now, we see this, and this is what's so fascinating, is in Libya. And our founding fathers talked about this. I mean, this is another principle. If you go back to the rationale behind the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms, the founding fathers understood this. Americans understood this. They understood that government is the greatest threat to their freedom, their own government, not the foreign governments, not the terrorists, not the drug dealers, not the illegal aliens, none of that. They understood the greatest threat to their freedom was their very own government. That's why they put the government in this straitjacket. That's why they had the Bill of Rights to send a message: don't be jacking with these fundamental rights. So they understood that. But they said the right to keep and bear arms is like an insurance policy. That if there is tyranny, that people have a right to defend themselves from that. Now, notice what's happening in Libya. You've got these government goons, which everybody, I think, will recognize as part of a dictatorial, tyrannical regime. I mean, classic definition. Dictatorship, tyranny, oppression, rounding people up, raping them, terrorizing them, and all for the privileged group within the government. And this has been going on for 40 years. So when these goons start shooting defenseless protesters, the protesters don't have the ability to defend themselves by shooting back against these cowardly goons. I mean, you've got the troops that are obeying orders, from their commander-in-chief, Gaddafi, and they're shooting people in the back. They're shooting people while they're sleeping in the park. I mean, these are just cowards. They're cowardly murderers. They're government murderers, okay? But the people, the protesters, don't have the ability to defend themselves by firing back at these guys. That's what they don't have because of gun control. Now, obviously, this is a real-life revolution, and so you've got all of a sudden parts of the people in the government that are shifting to the other side. They don't want any part of this, including the military. The part of the military is shifting over to the side of the people, and so they're opening up the armories and they're opening up the ability to have guns. And so now all of a sudden the dictator, the tyrants, now it's getting to be more of an equal little match here, because the people are able to defend themselves with guns against the cowardly goons that are using guns to murder them. And our founding fathers understood this clearly. I mean, this is why, by the way, they were against standing armies. You look back at their rationale. They said standing armies are extremely dangerous to a free society because they will obey the orders of their commander-in-chief. They will do what they're told. That's what they're trained to do. That's what their mindset is. And that's, of course, what we're seeing in Libya, where you've got these government goons following orders and so forth. Now, some of them have shifted again, which is a fascinating phenomenon. And so we'll see how it plays out. Now, there's a great legal case that I'd highly advise you to read. It's called Silvera versus Lockyer. Just Google it. It's Silveira versus Lockyer. And take a look at the opinion of Judge Alex Kosinski. This encapsulates one of the best summaries of the right to keep and bear arms. And what Judge Kosinski in there says is that, look, the right to keep and bear arms is essentially a doomsday weapon. It's one that you hope never comes into existence, that never materializes. But if doomsday happens, you're going to be glad that you had this right to keep and bear arms. And what he says is that, here in America, you imagine a situation where all of a sudden there's an extreme emergency, and you've got people with dictatorial dreams, military or civilian or whatever, take the reins of government and say, well, this is an emergency. We can't have elections indefinitely. And they start rounding up people, and they put people in prison without trials, and they torture them, and they rape them, and they execute them. And, in other words, they do all the things that these dictators in the Middle East are doing to people and have been doing to people. Well, Kosinski says, if you got a well-armed citizenry, if that doomsday ever happens, then they can at least defend themselves. They can maybe stop that tyranny. But if you disarm and you have a disarmed citizenry, that is a mistake, Kosinski points out, that people will only be allowed to make once. Because that's it. Because once the totalitarian dictators take office, whether it's the military or some other cabal that is trying to protect national security from the chaos of democracy in the middle of this emergency and so forth. Once that happens and the people are disarmed, that's it. You comply or you die, which is essentially what's going on in Libya and many of these other countries. So our founding fathers understood all this, and this is why they opposed standing armies. This is why they favored the right to keep and bear arms, and this is what Kosinski's saying. Essentially, the right to keep and bear arms, it's an insurance policy, and it actually dissuades people in government from trying such a thing because they know that Americans are well armed and able to defend themselves. In other words, a disarmed citizenry is a citizenry that will be submissive. It will be subservient. It will be saying yes, sir, to the tyrants. It will be kissing their boots. But a well-armed citizenry doesn't have to kiss anybody's boots because they have the ability to defend themselves. Now, there's another fascinating aspect of this Libya situation. Guess where Gaddafi, who I think everybody acknowledges is a brutal dictator, but this is not new. Gaddafi's been a brutal dictator for a long time, and so have these other dictators. Well, guess where Gaddafi got his weaponry? Yeah, from the British government. Now, the British government, as everyone knows, is sort of the poodle to the U.S. empire. After World War II, the British Empire was broke. They were bankrupt. This is what happens with empires. They go broke and bankrupt. That's what's happening to the U.S. empire that is still spending, $1.6 trillion more than it's bringing in. It's slowly or quickly leading America into bankruptcy. Well, that's what happened to the British Empire after World War II. They lost their empire. They were bankrupt. And but they decided to become a poodle to the American empire. They said, okay, guys, we glory in empire. Can you please let us tag along with you? And so, when the British government sells arms to a dictator like Gaddafi, believe me, it's with the full approval of the U.S. empire. If the U.S. empire said no, the British government would never have done this. Now, of course, who's the biggest arms seller? This is the real irony of this thing. The U.S. government that, where U.S. officials constantly are calling for gun control and all this. Guess who's the biggest gun seller, weapon seller, tank seller, missile seller, bullet seller in the world? Yeah, the U.S. empire. And of course, in combination with the British, guess who has been funneling, supplying, providing arms for all these dictators in the Middle East? Yes, the U.S. government. That is the principal arms seller. And it has been the supporter, along with the British, of Gaddafi, of Mubarak. I mean, that's where the U.S. arms have been going to Mubarak, while the British have been supplying Gaddafi, the dictator in Bahrain, the dictator in Tunisia, the dictator in Jordan, the dictator in Saudi Arabia. These are all dictators that the U.S. empire has been providing the weaponry that they've been using to suppress the people for decades. I mean, that's why it's really kind of amusing to see U.S. officials, we're going to put sanctions on Gaddafi now. And they're standing with the demonstrators in Egypt, and they're going to stand with the demonstrators in Bahrain, and they're speaking out against these tyrants that are killing defenseless people, their own people. But the reason this is so funny is, where have been these U.S. officials, including liberals? Remember, liberals love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, and they're now standing with the demonstrators, and they're now speaking out against the dictators. Where have they been for the last 30 years? They've been silent. Their lips have been sealed because this have been their dictators. Now, let me tell you something. These people that are demonstrating and risking their lives and dying at the hands of these goons and cowardly murderers, they didn't get angry overnight. This anger has been simmering under the surface for decades during the time that the U.S. has been providing these weapons to Mubarak and Bahrain and Jordan and so forth. And while the British government, the poodle, has been supplying the weaponry to Gaddafi. Now, believe me, when these people say, well, we just thought it was their Department of Defense, defend against invasions and so forth. Nonsense. They knew when they supplied these armaments that there's one purpose why these dictators wanted these tanks, these bullets, these automatic weapons and so forth, was to ensure that people just did what they were told, live in abject poverty, while the dictators live with their nice little, resorts and, living the life of the king, the good life. And who could ever stand up against a government that's got all the guns supplied by the British and the U.S. empire? And finally, people get to a point where they say, enough's enough. We're willing to die. So this is what Jefferson said, that, people will put up with a lot of tyranny until they finally say, no, I can't put up with it. You've raped my sister, you've raped my daughter, that's enough. And so they're willing to risk their lives, even though they don't have any guns or anything. They figure that just the massive protests, but every time they go out and protest, they know there's going to be a certain percentage of them that just shot in cold blood. So there's a lot of hypocrisy here. Now, the support of these dictatorships, it's not anything new. I mean, this is where Americans need to do some soul searching. That these are well-armed dictators that are oppressing their own people, and they've been armed by our government. And, I see a lot of outrage against the dictators, and I see outrage against how they're treating their people. But except for libertarians, I don't see any outrage among all these Christians that go to church every Sunday here in America. I don't see any outrage over the role that their government has played. I mean, their government has been the partner, the enabler of these tyrannical governments. They've been the ones supplying the weaponry, knowing what the purpose of that weaponry was. Where is the conscience? Where is the anger? Where is the outrage? Oh, sure, it's easy to direct that outrage against a foreign government. Oh, look at that bad dictator. Oh, well, man, I'm going to really exclaim against the dictator. And, it's easy for some minister to get up in that pulpit and say, oh, let's pray for the people, the victims of this tyranny and so forth. But what's not easy is what libertarians have been doing, but what Americans need to be doing. They need to be confronting their government's role in all this. And it's not just this bunch of dictators. We saw it with Saddam Hussein, remember? Remember throughout the 90s when Saddam Hussein was the official enemy? The Berlin Wall had fallen. The military, the U.S. military, the military-industrial complex didn't know what to do. They said, don't dismantle us, no peace dividend, please, please. Okay, the communist threat's over, but the communists could come back. And, there's the drug war. The military can fight the drug war. And, well, of course, in 1990, they found a new official enemy, and that was Saddam Hussein. And, we have short memories sometimes, but I remember very distinctly throughout the 1990s, there was never any talk about the Muslim threat and the terrorist threat and the Islamic threat and the communist threat. None of that. It was all Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein. And people were obsessed with Saddam Hussein. Everything. Oh, he's coming to get us. We got to do something about Saddam. Conservatives were really hep on this for 9 or 10 years. That's what the sanctions against Iraq were about, that killed those hundreds of thousands of children and so forth. Well, okay, he was a brutal dictator. But let me tell you something. It wasn't new. In the 1980s, he was just as brutal a dictator as he was in the 90s. So in the 90s, when they were saying, he's a Hitler, he's evil, man, can the world survive with Saddam Hussein? In the 1980s, he was no different. But guess what? In the 1980s, the U.S. government was his supporter, his enabler, his partner, patting him on the back, doing a good job. You know why George W. Bush knew that he was going to find weapons of mass destruction over there? Quote, knew, because he had the receipts. Because guess what? In the 1980s, it was the U.S. that was furnishing Saddam Hussein the chemical weapons, the biological weapons. You can go to our website at fff.org, type into the search vehicle, where did Iraq get its weapons of mass destruction? Just type in where did Iraq, and you'll see all the articles that we've compiled showing that, Saddam Hussein was our government's dictator, just like Mubarak has been, just like the dictator in Bahrain and so forth. And this is the hypocrisy and the blowback. And this is what libertarians have been saying ever since 9/11, that hey, the reason there's so much anger and hatred, this is one of them, the support of the dictators. Now Americans don't know about this, you see, because they say, oh, my government's exceptional, they would never support dictators. And that's what all this propaganda now is about. We got to stand with the people, and all this is to cover up the U.S. government's role in all this. Now, it's interesting. There's an article in the New York Times today by Jim Dwyer called Mubarak, Terrorism and Their Tie. And he's talking about the blind sheik that was responsible for the terrorist bombing of the World Trade Center. No, not on 9/11. 1993, that terrorist attack. And he brings up the fact of what the sheik was saying. He was bringing up Mubarak during that period of time, saying, look, your support of Mubarak is part of the anger that we have in all this. Well, yeah, duh. The dictator Mubarak's been going on, for a long time, and the U.S. has been supporting him for a long time. In fact, if I've pointed this out many times in my articles and so forth, that another terrorist that was convicted as part of the 93 attacks, Ramzi Youssef, at his sentencing hearing, you could see, just by reading the transcript, the anger and rage of this man, that he was motivated not by hatred for America's freedom and values, but, like the statists say, but because of what the U.S. government had been doing in foreign affairs, including the killing of the Iraqi children with the sanctions, the support of the dictatorships. He talked about the hypocrisy of the U.S. government, and this is what Americans need to confront. That the support of these dictators, that's one important thing. We need an examination in this country. What has been the extent of that support? You got $2 billion a year in military armaments to the Mubarak regime. You got the British government supplying Gaddafi. You've got the U.S. government supplying the Bahrain dictator, the Tunisian dictator, the Yemen dictator. We need to figure out what's the extent of all that. What are the torture agreements? These are regimes that have been torturing people. And we've got to keep in mind, it's something that Americans just don't want to confront, that this is not a new phenomenon, that the U.S. government has been involved in torture a long time. You've got, move over to Latin America. Remember all the support of those right-wing regimes that were going out torturing people and raping people. I mean, you look at the Pinochet regime. That was a U.S. favored regime. They loved the Pinochet regime. The Guatemalan regime. Remember after they ousted Arbenz, the democratically elected president, whose philosophy was pretty much like Franklin Roosevelt's in terms of socialism? Well, they ousted him because he was taking land from the United Fruit Company, a U.S. corporation with big pull in Congress and so forth. And then they put in a series of military regimes, and they supported these regimes. They trained them at the School of the Americas. I mean, Google a lady named Deanna Ortiz, Ortiz. She's a Catholic nun that was assigned to spread the Lord's work in Guatemala, and she's got a book out. I mean, you would be absolutely amazed at what they put her through. I mean, I can't even tell you. It's so horrific. When they took her into custody, these right-wing goons down in Guatemala, and they did horrific things to this nun. This is a U.S.-supported regime. This is nothing new. I mean, this idea of torture is not just, it happened at Abu Ghraib, apples, bad apples. Nonsense. It's been going on a long time. There's a great book out, The United States and Torture by Marjorie Cohn. Highly recommend you take a look at it. I'm just starting to read it, but it's a real, it gives you a great summary of the U.S. government's role in torture in these dictatorial regimes and supporting these dictatorial regimes. It's got great contributors, Alfred McCoy, who's written a lot about torture, Jane Mayer, who wrote that great book on the war on terrorism and torture. So this looks like a really good book. But this is where Americans need to start confronting. We need to do soul searching. We can't just accept the idea that, the federal governments are God. It's our provider. It's our welfare provider. In fact, let me read you something else. I mean, you'll get a kick out of this, I think. I mean, there are some amusing aspects of this whole thing. This is what Gaddafi has offered. Libyan state television, this is from the New York Times, also announced that the government would give $400 to every family and raise the salaries of state employees by as much as 150% in what appeared to be an attempt to buy support. I mean, does that sound familiar or what? I mean, this guy's no dummy. In fact, guess how he's justifying this assault on the protesters? That they're all a bunch of drug users and terrorists, and he cited Osama bin Laden. Now, where do you think he got that idea? I mean, really, isn't that the perfect strategy? Drug users, drug dealers, war on drugs, terrorism, color alert, up to red, Osama bin Laden, he's coming to get us. Saddam Hussein coming to get us. I mean, this guy's a genius. I mean, he's just saying, yeah, man, this is the way to get people to rally to the government. Because, it's worked in other countries. If you just mention the war on drugs or the war on terrorism and, put a little cherry on top with Osama bin Laden, people will immediately forget their problems and rally to the government, not realizing that this is the way government takes away people's freedoms. But now he's even adding to it where he says, I'm willing to give you guys $400. I mean, why didn't he start offering grants to the communities or maybe offer a little bit of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid? See, he knows that if he puts people on the dole, that reduces their incentive to resist the empire because people that are on the dole are not going to fundamentally challenge the wrongdoing of their government because they're dependent on the dole. They're scared that the government might cut them off. And this guy's not any dummy. He's over there saying, war on drugs, war on terrorism, Osama bin Laden, and hey, I'll give you a bigger dole if you'll just keep me in power. So it's really kind of amusing. He's not the only one. This is from the New York Times, and this is about Morocco. He says, because, there's people protesting Morocco too. But the advisor who asked for anonymity because he was not authorized to speak publicly said the king was listening. Having recently promised to invest $1.9 billion in subsidies to ease high prices for food and basic commodities. So, hey, he's promising, like farm subsidy. Where have we seen this before? I mean, these guys are geniuses. I mean, you ever get the feeling that maybe they have seminars where they say secrets to retaining power? Mention the war on drugs, mention the war on terrorism, raise the color codes, and buy off the citizenry with, subsidies and welfare and grants for your community and jobs for your community and so forth. And of course, the other factor of this is, and this shows you how all these interventions start to integrate, is the blowback. And this is what Chalmers Johnson said in his great book, Blowback, one of the ones that predicted that 9/11 was going to happen. We said that, we were going to have terrorism on American soil before 9/11. Didn't take a rocket scientist to predict it, is because you've got all this anger and hatred developing with the support of these dictatorships. They're providing them with armaments, training them, helping them suppress their people, standing by while they're torturing their own people, and all with the idea of order and stability and so forth. And finally, that anger and hatred erupts. It erupted in 1993 at the World Trade Center, the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the U.S. coal, and of course 9/11. But they keep doing the same thing, and so then they use that as the excuse to then come over here and engage in anti-terrorist legislation, which, by the way, the Mubarak regime had to, and the military regime is continuing. That is, the right to arbitrarily arrest people, detain them indefinitely, torture them, national security courts. Where have we heard all this? Well, and of course, gun confiscation is part of all this. So you've got, the foreign interventionism, the support of the dictators, the sanctions, the embargoes, the anger erupts, the terrorist retaliation. That's then used for the, anti-terrorist legislation, the enemy combatant doctrine, gun control, that immigration control, and then you've got the war on drugs that's integrated in all this, which is then, that's the terrorists are funding themselves with drugs and stuff. This is what Gaddafi's doing. He's integrating the war on terrorism with the war on drugs. And then, all of this, culminates in, we've got to confiscate guns to keep America safe. And it's all leading in the wrong direction. And this is, again, where we return to first principles. That this is not the kind of country our founding fathers envisioned. This is not the kind of country our American ancestors bequeathed to us. This is not a government that should be funneling arms to anyone, much less dictators. It's not a government that should be training the military forces of any regime, much less dictatorial regimes, which is what they've been doing with these dictatorial regimes. The Pentagon's been training these goons. And this is not the role of government in a free society. And this is what I keep saying week after week. Americans need to do some soul searching. We need to take a look at ourselves. We can't just point fingers at all these dictators and say, isn't that terrible? We need to be looking at ourselves. We need to be looking at our own country. We need to be looking at our own government. We need to be looking at first principles. The right to live your life the way you choose, so long as your conduct is peaceful, which means ditching the war on drugs, getting rid of it, getting rid of these drug lords, and yes, getting rid of all the bribes. Sorry, judges and police officers and so forth. Get rid of all that stuff. Ditch the war on drugs. Ditch the excuse for the war on guns. Ditch the foreign interventionists, the empire. Liberate the private sector, the American people, to interact with the people of the world. So that's my show tonight. And that's the idea of the right to keep and bear arms. Appreciate you listening in. And if you're not subscribing to our FFF email update, I'd like to invite you to do it, free for the charge. If you like our work, we depend on voluntary support. We'd love to have you donating to us and helping us advance these ideas. I think that we may be on the cusp of a great awakening in this country. I mean, you don't see it in Washington, except, of course, with Ron Paul, but you see it with, all across the country. Libertarianism is rising in prominence and influence, and you see libertarian perspectives. I mean, we share with people every day in our FFF email update libertarian perspectives. They may not be written by libertarians, but they're libertarian positions on various issues of the day. And I think we may be on the cusp of a great awakening of liberty in this country. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be exciting to see the American people cause everybody else around the world to stop dead in their tracks? And as they watch the Americans lead the world to the real principles of freedom. So thank you very much, and see you next Saturday.